Okay, the first unit is called the real number system. And lesson one is really just using the right words to describe where numbers are classified. So the first initial we will have is R, and that stands for real numbers. And I'm going to use the number symbol. Okay, and that just involves all numbers. I mean, whether they're fractions, decimals, that just covers everything. And then we have two sets underneath there. We have irrational numbers, and so I abbreviate that with IRR. Sometimes you might just see it with an I, but we're going to use IRR. And those would be decimals that never end. So for example, 0.234, and then it might go dot, dot, dot. It also involves decimals that do not repeat. So again, like 234, and then you might have a 2 somewhere, but it's not going to be the same pattern. So you kind of think of like mumbo jumbo numbers. The most common one you think of is pi. Any of the square roots that aren't perfect squares. So for example, the square root of 3. If you put that in your calculator, it's going to go on forever. Okay, you could also have a negative sign out here. So that would be the square root of 3 and then the opposite of that, so it would make it negative. So those are irrational numbers. If you think about pi, it goes on forever and it never repeats. Okay, and then the other set of numbers are these rational numbers. So those rational numbers they all are fractions and decimals that end or have a repeated pattern. And so we abbreviate that with R. So for example, if you had the fraction 1/3, when you divide that, that's 0.3 repeating. And so that would be a rational number. Okay, you could also have like the square root of 16, because when you solve that, that equals 4. And so that stops. You could have a decimal like 0.067. And since that stops, it could even be negative. It's still considered rational. So they have to stop or repeat. And sometimes if you have like a square root or a fraction, you need to turn it into a decimal form to see what it does. Okay, and then underneath that, you have integers, and we're going to abbreviate that with an I. And integers are just all positive and negative whole numbers. So you could have a -2, you could have a 16, you could have a 5,000, and you might want to write off to the side. These are all positive and negative whole numbers. So then what is a whole number with a W? That is 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Whole numbers start with 0, and it's all the numbers that you would count with, like if you're counting objects. Natural numbers, which are also called counting numbers, sometimes you hear them called counting numbers, those are the ones that you would teach like a little kid how to count. So you'd go 1, 2, 3. It does not include 0, and it goes on forever. So now we're going to name all the sets of numbers that each of these belong to, or you call it classify. So on 30, and what I do is I start with the counting number or the natural number. And so it would be natural, because you would get to that if you're counting. And then a little trick is once you find out where it is, if it's natural, then it's automatically going to be the rest of these. So it's going to be a whole, it's going to be an integer, and it's going to be rational. And every number has to be irrational or rational, one or the other. Okay, -11. Is that a counting number? No. When you're counting objects, you're not going to be negative. Is it a whole number? No, because it's not on the positive side. So it starts as an integer because it is a negative number, and it's a whole. a whole negative, I guess. Not, it's not a whole number, but, and then since it's an integer, then it's also rational.